and welcome to another episode of Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Sarah Jaffe. On the 7th of January, Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old prize-winning poet and mother of three, was murdered by Immigration and Customs Enforcement Officer Jonathan Ross. Good was at the time acting as a legal observer of ICE activities in Minneapolis. The killing of Good has sparked protests across the state of Minnesota and beyond, and at the time of recording, Donald Trump is threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, a rarely used law that allows active duty military personnel to be deployed for law enforcement duties. And 1,500 soldiers currently stationed in Alaska are reportedly on standby for deployment to Minneapolis. My guest Sarah Jaffe has reported extensively on protests and organising in Minnesota, and in today's episode we spoke about the political background to the current situation in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St Paul. We talked about the central role of the Somali community in resistance and union organising, and how this has drawn the ire of Donald Trump. And we talked about the longer history of protest in the region that includes the state's central role in the Black Lives Matter movement. We also spoke about the entwinement of the tech industry and the surveillance state and the border regime, and how protesters in some US cities have sought to target tech company assets that are believed to be aiding ICE and US Customs and Border Protection. Included in today's show notes, you'll find links to recent articles by Sarah on these topics, as well as a list of resources that she's compiled that includes links to organisations organising to resist ICE and the broader attack on migrants. Sarah Jaffe is a writer and reporter and the author of Work Won't Love You Back, How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted and Alone, and Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, and her latest book, From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire. Sarah's work has appeared in The Nation, The Washington Post, The New Republic, The New York Review of Books, and many other outlets. She also co-hosts the Heart Reacts podcast with Craig Gent, an advice podcast for everyone trying to remain emotionally functional through the collapse of late capitalism. If you find today's interview useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content, such as the upcoming Listener Questions episode with Richard Seymour. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/poltheoryother to sign up. So Sarah, we're obviously talking a little over a week since the murder of Renee Nicole Good by Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent Jonathan Ross in Minneapolis. And you've done a lot of reporting over the years on Minnesota and the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St Paul. And in a recent article for The Progressive, you've written about the broader political context of Good's murder and how Minnesota has been a hotbed of both opposition to violence perpetrated by ICE and the police, and also a centre of union organising, including in logistics and service sectors where many migrants work. And you describe in particular the importance of people of Somali descent to those various organising efforts. And you interviewed for the article people who've been targeted by ICE and involved in resistance to ICE and in union organising. So can you expand a bit on the political context and the centrality of people from Somali backgrounds to the various forms of activism and political resistance we've seen in Minnesota for quite a long time now?
Yeah, so Donald Trump's pretext for sending troops, thousands of troops at this point, into the Twin Cities is that there was some sort of fraud perpetrated by some people who got some COVID funding that turned out to be some of them of Somali descent. And the Twin Cities actually has a huge Somali population. As the U.S. has been involved militarily in Somalia for quite a long time, we've been taking in also people from there. And the Twin Cities has this incredibly vibrant community that has been, among other things, built this worker center, the Awood Center, which is the Somali word for power, that was actually the first group of workers in the United States to get Amazon to bargain, right? Amazon has notoriously not bargained with the Amazon labor union that actually won a union election a couple of years ago now in Staten Island. But because of the organizing of this particular group of workers, they actually did win some concessions from Amazon, notably around prayer time and lessened quotas during the month of Ramadan when people would be fasting, and also, packing your Amazon products. So this is how I first heard about this organization. They've also been organizing in recent years with rideshare drivers, and they've got a couple of prominent political representatives, notably people who are listening to PTO have probably heard of Ilhan Omar and maybe haven't heard of Omar Fattah, who came in second in the Minneapolis mayoral election this past year. And so there's this really, really incredible organizing that I think is in fact part of why Trump's so pissed off at people of Somali descent, right? It's not actually because of the horrible racist things he says about garbage people and whatever. It's actually because this community is incredibly organized, powerful, and politically represented at some of the highest levels.
And do you think that's a point that really needs to be emphasized and understood more widely? Because there can be a sort of disempowering quality to some of the narrative around ICE and their invasions of various
Yeah.
states and cities, and that by seeing that, as you described, that Trump's preoccupation with people from Somali backgrounds is a sort of tribute to their organizing. It's almost a sort of backhanded compliment to what they've been able to achieve there, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things, labor researcher Ruth Milkman has been pointing this out for decades now, that the labor movement often in the U.S. has been sort of guilty of assuming that immigrant workers are sort of unorganizable, that they're this sort of lumpen proletariat, right, that is not as radical, that comes with sort of backward politics, right? This is not just a set of ideas that are unique to Donald Trump and the Trumpists. This is a set of ideas that unfortunately a lot of white people hold, even ones who consider themselves on the left. And going back to the 1990s, Ruth Milkman and others have been pointing out that actually the immigrant organizations have been the ones leading the labor movement, that most of the growth has been in service sector, healthcare sector work that is full of immigrant workers, and that these are people who are bringing radical traditions often from the countries that they come to the U.S. from, countries that, again, the U.S. has been invading and bombing and whatevering, often in part because of that political resistance. And your listeners, of course, have just heard you talking about the U.S. Kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, and Venezuelans have also been a big target of Trump. So this targeting of these communities is, again, it's sort of giving people a chance to see how well organized these communities are. And also in places like Minneapolis and Chicago in particular, I think, and Los Angeles, of course, you're seeing how central immigrant communities are to the labor movements and to left movements, progressive movements in those cities as a whole. So immigrant organizations like AWUD Situl, which is a Latino migrant organization, Unidos, the SEIU Local 26, which is a building service workers local, which has a lot of immigrant members, a lot of immigrant workers in leadership. These are not just sort of, fringe groups that we have to protect because they're sad. These are actually the people who have made these cities progressive places to live in the first place.
Do you think the radicalism and degree of organisation that there is among immigrant communities comes as something of a shock, not just to the state, but to business as well? Because obviously, there is a phenomenon of corporations seeking to exploit migrant workers who are perceived to be potentially more compliant because of their precarious immigration status, say, and that they will accept paying conditions that other workers might not. And so do you think they therefore end up being a bit surprised by the reality?
I think Amazon was certainly surprised by these workers, right? They were very particularly sort of advertising for workers, right? When I spoke to a man named Muhammad Mireh, who is, quoted him in this article. I also spoke to him for my book, From the Ashes. He was, saying like they recruited in our community. They would put up ads in our language asking for people to come work at Amazon. And, people come to this country. They've heard of Amazon. Ooh, this is a big company. This is going to be a good job. Then when you find out that it's actually a horrible job, there's this expectation, right, that you will be grateful because you have been let into this wonderful, amazing place that is the United States of America. And the reality is often, of course, very, very different, not just for immigrants, but for everyone. So when you see the leadership of the AWUD Center is a lot of young women who wear hijab, who Amazon may be expected to be like quiet and compliant, and they are anything but, and they are very well aware of their rights. And they come from a community that has incredible solidarity and that has built real strength, sometimes in kind of cross-class ways, but often within a working class that is aware that it gets the short end of the stick within the city, and that it is still, for all the progressive politics in the Twin Cities, there's still plenty of racism, right? And so Black immigrant workers get a lot of crap thrown at them. And I do think that it comes as a complete shock sometimes when they are the ones whose organizing we should all actually be learning from.
You mentioned there the case of Minnesota Amazon workers who used wildcat strikes, walkouts, and other forms of broader community organizing, not just in the service of more conventional workplace goals like improved pay and conditions, but also, as you described, to win space and time for prayer for observant Muslim workers. And in the piece, you write that it was those very culturally specific demands that actually produced tangible wins, victories that also helped non-Muslim, non-Somali workers. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because one can easily imagine that such a goal could be seen as quite secondary or of limited importance or just of a concern to a particular community, and very much in contrast to the idea that union organisers should be focused on bread and butter issues. And in particular, could you say something about how that victory did, as you say, help non-Muslim and non-Somali workers too?
Yeah, there's a real tendency to think that union issues have to be sort of lowest common denominator issues. They have to be issues that affect absolutely everyone, and that ends up being pay, right? Even like pay and conditions, like which conditions get to matter, right? If you are fasting for the month of Ramadan and you have to keep up a ridiculous and sort of ever-increasing quota speed of how quickly you're going to pack some boxes, that's going to be friggin' exhausting. Those are working conditions, right? But also, the thing that I have found in going on 20 years as a labor journalist is that the thing that makes workers actually take action, right, that makes workers angry enough to unionize, to strike, to go up against the boss, especially to go up against some of the biggest bosses in the world when we're talking about companies like Amazon, is dignity. And dignity it's this messy, intangible thing, right? When I was talking to folks who organized the UAW union at the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, it was a lot about how the managers talked to them. In this Amazon warehouse, it was about having time to pray and space to do that properly, right? But it's always about, and I think this is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of in the age of AI, it's always about being treated like a human being, right? Who has actual human needs, who has a life outside of the workplace, who is as intrinsically valuable as the manager who is talking to them like they're something they scraped off the bottom of their shoe. And, you know, there's a whole line of thinking that people, oh, this is just liberal identity politics, right? And it's true that at the time that Amazon made a deal around around prayer time with these particular workers, they were working a little bit harder to have their nice progressive reputation, which now, it's been a mask-off moment in the second Trump administration, certainly, for a lot of these companies. Mark Zuckerberg's out there talking about bringing masculine energy back into the workplace, which is hilarious for anybody who's ever seen Mark Zuckerberg. But, it is nevertheless the case that the thing that makes people fight is often very specific to those people, but it will come back to that issue of dignity. And then once people are willing to fight, they're willing to fight for a lot of things. And you can learn that you have power. You learn how to use that power for a variety of things. So actually getting more control over the quotas in the workplace will help everyone, right? Having some clear disciplinary procedures will benefit everybody who works in that workplace. But also being part of an organized workplace that is willing to walk off the job when they fire somebody, walk off the job when somebody gets disciplined unfairly, that certainly benefits everyone. And that is built through tangible wins, even when sometimes those wins are really small, right? When you know that your workplace has the power to, if somebody gets fired, gets yelled at, everybody's going to walk off until they bring that guy back in. That's a total change in this workplace. I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds of American labor law, but there's one sort of basic concept at the heart of American labor law, and this is the idea of protected concerted activity. And if you are acting collectively with your coworkers to improve your conditions in the workplace, that is protected by American labor law, whether or not you're a member of a union. And so organizations like the Wood Center, like many of these other worker centers that aren't technically unions, use that to great advantage.
Just going back to the specific demand for prayer time, I imagine another benefit to addressing such concerns from the side of union organisers is that by doing that, you are addressing people as people in their fullness, right? As not merely rational economic actors who are just out to sort of maximise their income and other more overtly sort of economistic
Exactly.
concerns. Not to say obviously that stuff isn't hugely important, but it's not the only thing, right?
Well, and if you look at what's going on right now in the Twin Cities and in other cities in the U.S. that are facing these surges of ICE and Border Patrol and other whatever troops Trump can get his hands on, frankly, these are places where organizations that are leading the charge are often labor organizations, and they are nevertheless standing up for workers, not just in their workplace, but in their community, in their neighborhood, at the schools. This sense of we are human and we have human value. An injury to one is an injury to all, right? The very old wobbly slogan. That practice is what is standing people in such good stead right now, right? That understanding that people don't lead, as Jane McAlevey would always say, single issue lives, right? That's what is creating this sense of solidarity in the streets that is just, I'm assuming many of your listeners have seen these videos by now. Really incredible videos of like people being de-arrested, right? Of people standing up to ICE in sometimes really physical ways, of parents forming these lines outside of the schools to keep the kids safe, right? Like that comes from an understanding that organizing, it's not just about taking on capital sort of narrowly, right? And this is a little pet peeve, if you'll permit me. There was this little, I really wish people would not get our information from the internet, even though I'm also watching all the short form videos. There was a thing going around that was like, ICE is a money-making scheme. And it's like, well, no, that's not what it means to think in terms of capitalism, right? To understand how capital flows. It's a little bit more complicated than just private prisons. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore has pointed out over and over again, if we only took down the private prisons and the private ICE detention centers, that would be like a tiny sliver of the prison industrial complex, right? The amount of public funding that is going into creating public jobs, like the one of Jonathan Ross who shot Renee Good, that's my tax dollars, right? That's not privatized. Those are directly creating government jobs. They're laying off hundreds, thousands of other government jobs in order to do it, to shift the budget around. But like, to understand how capitalism actually works, you have to understand it as a totalizing system. And that means to understand that it affects us everywhere we go, everywhere we live, everywhere we move, not just because we're all carrying around smartphones, but because it creates the strictures in which we live our lives. And to quote Ruthie Gilmore again, because why not? The issues that bite into people's lives are the ones that that people will choose to fight over. So sometimes it's prison, sometimes it's a cop shooting somebody, sometimes it's the public school, sometimes it's lunches in public schools, right? It's so many different things that make up having a decent and dignified life.
Clearly, what's going on at the moment represents a step change in the severity and violence of the border regime and the migration system in the United States. We've seen a dramatic increase in the militarization of ICE. Funding has gone up. Some quite dramatic graphs doing around on social media which attest to this. But nonetheless, a situation before Donald Trump, it was hardly a benign one. But the cruelty of the system as it existed before seemed to be a bit more obviously congruent with the needs of capital. So sectors of the population were kept sort of in a precarious position regarding their right to remain in the United States. There was a turn the tap on and off when it came to the presence of migrants. We accept people when they're needed. And if it comes to the point where they're not needed, then we try and return them to their place of origin. And that seems to particularly characterize the migration flows across the southern border of the United States. In the current context, where the violence and the determination to deport and prevent entry seems far greater. Is it your sense that capital is in some sense suffering due to these policies, or are they in fact finding ways in which to achieve their goals and maintain profitability in the context of that ratcheting up of repression?
I think we have to talk about capital in multiple different sectors in this place, right? That when we're talking about, like in California, right, what I was writing about the ICE surge in Los Angeles last summer, right, there was in Los Angeles and in the surrounding areas, right, where there's a lot of farmland, also a lot of data centers, also a lot of, other forms of logistics work, right, warehouses, all of that stuff. Those companies would sort of say, like, hey, please don't take our workers, right? The crops will rot in the fields if you start kidnapping farm workers. And it is, despite all of the complaints about the immigrants taking our jobs, it's actually really hard to find people who want to go out into a field in, 100-degree Fahrenheit, really, really unpleasant conditions and pick vegetables for barely enough money. And often, it's piecework. So you get paid by how much you pick, right? People aren't actually lining up to get those jobs. Shocking, I know. People are not thrilled with this. There's a story making the rounds today of ICE agents going into a Mexican restaurant in the suburbs somewhere in Minnesota and eating a nice meal and then going back after closing and arresting all the workers. And it's just like, are you kidding me, right? Like thinking about the restaurant industry in the U.S. Anthony Bourdain famously wrote a sort of beautiful piece on a love story to the immigrant line cook. Because if you go into the kitchen of basically any restaurant in any major city in the U.S., most of the line cooks are going to be immigrants. Maybe they have papers, maybe they don't. ICE doesn't really seem to care if people have papers or if they don't at this point. They are just straight up, racially profiling people. And so this, that's not going to make those sectors of capital very happy because they are losing people. And Trump sort of briefly said, we're going to hold off on these industries after the LA uprising. But they've rolled that back because, they've got quotas. And there are different sectors of capital and there are different sectors of the Trump administration, right? And you talked about this again recently, right, with the question of Venezuela and of, who is in charge. And with Donald Trump, it often seems that the policy that gets carried out is just the one favored by whoever talked to him last. If most of the growth, where is that number? It was something like 92% of the growth in the U.S. last year or something like that, right, came from tech, came from data centers, came from supposedly AI, which is technology that is being built to replace workers with computers, right? Then there's some sector of capital that doesn't really think it's going to need workers for very much longer at all. So, you're seeing these tensions, you're seeing these different facets of capital maybe clashing. You're seeing these different facets of capital finding their representatives within the administration and clashing. And you're seeing these different tensions play out within like the Democrats and whether or not they're willing to stand up to ICE, willing to stand up to Trump, any of those things. It's a real sort of mishmash right now. And this is, again, why I feel like sort of simplistic short form video clips are very bad places to be getting your information right now. Once we get into, capital wants X, well, which part of capital? And I think these are going to be really, really important questions, not just when we're thinking about the Trump administration, but thinking about the future writ large.
Going back to organising and resistance, what's your sense of how ICE has responded to that level of militancy? What kind of tactics have they adopted in response? Because I think one of the things you mention in your article is the way in which there has been a shift away from sort of mass roundups to these traffic stops, where it's easy to apprehend someone, arrest someone, just an individual in their car or maybe a couple of people, whereas targeting a location somewhere where lots of people work, obviously that provides a site where activists can go and try and assist, and it's, it can produce a very visible media site where word can get out about what's happening.
Yeah, there was that shift. There's the shift to pretextual traffic stops, which I wrote about in my piece for In These Times. This was in Memphis, which is yet another city with Black leadership and an organized working class that has been at the target of Trump's invasions. In Memphis, they had done a lot of organizing around pretextual traffic stops in the city in the wake of the killing of Tyree Nichols, who was a young skateboarder by the Memphis police, the city successfully banned these kinds of pretextual traffic stops only for the state to overrule them, the state government, and then the federal government is just sending in ICE to do them at absolutely absurd rates, right? And this is something specifically, again, I think it is not an accident that Trump is targeting cities. They're saying, oh, they're sanctuary cities, but it's not just that they're sanctuary cities, because sanctuary city policies are actually a very specific thing that says that local police are not supposed to cooperate with ICE or other federal agents. It's a very, very specific policy. Often it doesn't work because the cops themselves are fascists and they love Trump. The Minneapolis Fraternal Order of Police has put out a statement saying they stand with ICE, that kind of thing.
And I guess in Memphis, I mean, as you mentioned in the article, people there are also having to deal with the fact that they have the local government is on board with what Trump is doing, which isn't the case in many sort of blue states.
Yeah, this is also true in New Orleans, where I was living up until recently, right, which is yet another city that Trump has, sent more troops into. It's about to be carnival season. I'm going to be in carnival season in New Orleans with apparently the National Guard. So that's going to be interesting. But yeah, so what you see, right, is like on some level, ICE is taking tactics from local law enforcement that have been more or less targets of protest already. In other ways, they are visibly frustrated. Like, I think that part of the reason that the ICE agents in Minneapolis are so damn trigger happy, they've shot somebody else since Renee Good, too. He didn't die, as far as we know. But yeah, they shot another person of Venezuelan descent this time. Part of the reason I think that they're trigger happy is that they are being sort of effectively blocked from doing what they want to be doing, right? They don't like it when anybody stands up to them, whether those people are black, brown, white, migrant, citizen, whatever. They really don't like it. They don't like when people know their rights, right? They don't like that. So now they're starting to go door to door, apparently. And what do you do when you've got 5 guys pointing machine guns at you through your door, right? It's actually really hard for me to figure out sort of what level at which I want to convey. It is both really, really horrifying, and also the stuff that I'm seeing and hearing coming out of Minneapolis is some of the most inspiring organizing I've ever heard. And I've been obsessed with the organizing community in Minneapolis for at least a decade. So
yeah. No, it's a hard balance to
yeah,
take,
it's bad. Yeah. There's this sort of dialectic between, right, like tactics innovate, protesters innovate. This stuff, it pushes people to learn something new. Okay, ICE is now doing this. How do we stop that? The thing that people have been doing is distributing whistles in the community and having like whistle signals. So if you hear a whistle with certain, I don't know off the top of my head exactly what they are, but like if you hear that, either you run towards it or you run away from it, depending on what your migration status is, right? And those kinds of things are being built and are being shared between cities, right? So when we got the news that New Orleans was next on the list, I was watching all of my friends going, okay, we're doing this. We are fundraising, because New Orleans is a city with a massive service industry, and a lot of immigrants work in the service industry. So there was an immediate push for fundraising for people who were going to have to stay home, for small businesses maybe owned by immigrants that were going to close. That there was a friend of mine 3D printed 300 whistles, and just gave them out. It's like this kind of stuff. The internet is a wonderful way to share these tactics, but also, unfortunately, ICE has the internet, and they've also got great surveillance software provided to them by Palantir or whoever, right? That they are probably scraping everything off the internet that they can find about what people are doing to stand up to them. So it is in some ways, constant evolution. In other ways, it's just a frickin' war of attrition.
On the continuous learning process and the development of new tactics in response to what ICE is doing, I mean, that's not just a short-term phenomenon, right? That's also, that encompasses earlier protest movements. It encompasses Black Lives Matter. I think you talk about organising efforts even going back to the 1990s, and also inspiration from abroad, from other protest movements and sites of resistance.
Yeah, the way that this stuff has grown, I go back to this quote. Actually, it's funny. It's been 10 years almost since my first book came out. We've all been doing 2016 nostalgia on the internet this week, so I've been thinking about this. And in my very first book, I wrote about Occupy homes in Minneapolis, which is like the first Minneapolis organizing that I was writing about. And that was the Occupy Wall Street spinoff in the Twin Cities, because like it's really, really, really cold in Minnesota in the winter, as we've already discussed. Getting people into homes keeping people in their homes during the foreclosure crisis became a really big focus for obvious reasons. And so Kat Salonik, who was an organizer with Occupy Homes at the time I first met her, who is now the director of an organization called Tending the Soil, which is a coalition that includes some of these other Minnesota Twin Cities organizations, she described it in two ways. One was as a dandelion that got blown into the wind. And when I saw her, when I went back to Minneapolis to report from the ashes, she showed me a tattoo that she had gotten of that, right? Of the little seeds that go blow out and then they take root and then they become more dandelions. So there are all these different organizations that have people in them that were in Occupy Homes. There are all these organizations that have people in them that were involved in various rounds of Black Lives Matter organizing in Minneapolis after the deaths of Jamar Clark, of Philando Castile, after the death of course, George Floyd, which is the one that pretty much everyone in the world, I think, has heard of. And the other way she described it was when there's a big wave and it washes up, you try to... that happens and you can't really control when and how it's going to happen, these big protest waves, right? There wasn't the same level of nationwide uprising after the death of Jamar Clark as there was after the death of George Floyd. But then she described organizations like hers as like tide pools where you try to hold on to the people when the wave rolls back out. You try to make those pools a little bit bigger each time so that they're there. So those are the organizations that I've been reaching out to the past couple of weeks. And those are the organizations that have built this incredible sort of movement ecosystem in the Twin Cities. And they have called a day of no work, no school, no shopping, no nothing on the 23rd of January. And, you know, if any city in the U.S. can pull off a general strike, it's Minneapolis.
How widespread do you think is the understanding that the existing movement is built upon those prior movements? Or is it more your sense that people still tend to view the current resistance, or say Black Lives Matter, say at the time, as just representing a kind of spontaneous outbreak of fury because people have been pushed too hard, rather than seeing that longer term organising, patient, slow, that's been going on under the surface?
This is why I'm always doing this kind of journalism, right? And why I sort of go back to places over time, is to say, like, this is what I saw back then, right? I wrote this book that was about social movements in the U.S. after the financial crisis. That was my first book. And then when I went back for my most recent book, I was like, okay, I'm going back to these places. I went back to Minneapolis. I went back to St. Louis. I added new ones. This wave of organizing in Memphis was happening. And I wanted to see, like, okay, this is built on this. And this is, you know, it's also, I mean, it's how you do good journalism, is you just have sources that continue to trust you. But also, you see how it moves over time. You see how movements build and grow and change over time. You see who drops out of them and then pops up in interesting places. Like my friend Alex Hanna, who I met when I was working on that first book, because she was at the time the head of the Teaching Assistants Association at the University of Wisconsin, has now become one of the most sort of incisive critics of quote unquote AI, and just co-authored a book this past year called The AI Con. And so now Alex is really deeply involved in all this organizing that's going on around data centers and things like that. She had sort of taken a break for a little while, gone in a different direction, and suddenly pops back up. And so, like, that kind of stuff is so fascinating, because I love watching the way it moves. I think what it is important to understand the way these things move. And I'm always in conversation with my friend and comrade Rodrigo Nunes, right, who wrote the book Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. And I think the reason that I love that book is that it is capturing something really important about how movements actually work. And I've particularly quoted that book a lot when I'm writing about the Twin Cities, because I think it is the place that sort of shows that in action. Of thinking, not that we all have to be in lockstep, and not that we all have to have exactly the same demands and all be in the same vanguard party or whatever it is. But actually, if we think constantly about our broad alignment and what do we agree on, that can actually bring us really, really far. And you can get a lot of people in the streets facing off with, again, with ICE agents in masks and machine guns, because they believe the simple principle that you shouldn't kidnap our fucking neighbors. And we can fight about what the policies should all look like. And people have, a bunch of very different, very specific demands depending on what industry you work in or what political issue is your number one thing. But in this moment, it doesn't take agreement on everything to have agreement on like basic core principles. And not just agreement, but a real willingness to put your body on the line over those basic core principles. And that's what a friend messaged me the other day and said, how do you keep from despair? And I said, Jane McAlevey said to me, I think the first time I met her and the last time I talked to her before she passed was, the people are ready to fight. And that's just the best news I've ever heard.
I've seen people making just that sort of point on social media, saying a very good way to move on from last week's Twitter beef or whatever it might be is to show up in the streets with other people. Like, people forget that stuff. It doesn't matter at that point in time. Let's turn then to another recent article of yours, this one titled Capitalism Without Humans.
So much for letting go of the despair, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Although it does have a question mark at the end
Yes.
of the title, so we should include that caveat. So you wrote this for In These Times.
Yeah.
And in that article, you describe what you call as one of the sort of indelible images of the resistance to Trump and to ICE this time around, which was the torching of a string of automated Waymo taxis in Los Angeles. Now, for those unfamiliar, Waymo is an automated taxi company. It's a subsidiary of Alphabet, Google's parent company. And as you describe in the piece, they're operating in just a few cities, these sort of, as you call them, sort of high-tech hub cities, San Francisco, Phoenix, Austin. Now,
London's on the list. They want to come here.
something to look forward. Hopefully, Sadiq Khan will say no. The Waymo taxis were seemingly not targeted by protesters at random. Rather, you argue that these automated vehicles were attacked because they are tangible representations of shifts in the American economy towards automation, towards AI, that are particularly hurting migrants or may do so in short order, as well as just the otherwise kind of precariously employed. And another factor is also the history of that company and similar outfits and how they operate reveals the sort of the entwinement of the tech companies with agencies such as ICE and the surveillance state more generally. Can you expand on that and say something on how you see this example of the destruction of Waymo taxis as saying a lot about the current moment?
Yeah, we touched on this already a little bit, right? That like ICE has all these high-tech tools that are being provided by these high-tech contractors. The embedding of tech into this Trump administration has been really obvious from the beginning. Elon Musk has obviously been the face of it, but it's been all of them. We know that. I was not in Los Angeles when the Waymos were set on fire, unfortunately. Tech journalist Brian Merchant was and wrote about it that, protesters were calling them spy cars as they were set ablaze. That people are very aware, particularly in cities where tech is big business and is sort of in front and center, and, London being among those cities. People are aware of this stuff, right? And they're also aware that Uber and Lyft and ride-sharing companies and taxis in general, right, have been a way that people have made money, that a lot of immigrant workers have made money. But in general, also, in some place like Los Angeles, it's been a place where struggling actors have worked, right, have picked up some Uber shifts or Uber Eats shifts on the weekends. That these were jobs that helped people get through COVID, right? People who needed to pick up extra work often turned to doing some delivery work during the pandemic. And now they want to just automate the people out of this entirely. And, people are aware that these data centers are being built all over the place, that, once again, these are not going to be great producers of jobs, no matter what Keir Starmer says. And that the goal of them is to replace us. And their goal is to replace you and me as much as it is to replace an Uber driver, right? They'll replace whoever they can. This was notably in Los Angeles, central point in the Hollywood writers and actors strikes a couple of years ago, right? That they're aware that as soon as they can, the boss would love to replace us all with an algorithm or a robot. And somewhere while I was working on this piece, I spoke to Jeremy El-Haj from the Missouri Worker Center. And he was like, yeah, like there's a report that Amazon wants to automate 75% of its workforce. So there go all those nice Somali workers in Minneapolis, right? People are aware. And COVID, I think, before COVID, I would have told you that your boss doesn't care if you die, right? I wrote a book called Work Won't Love You Back for a reason. But during the pandemic, so many people had like the visceral experience of realizing their boss doesn't care if they die. And
Whilst being addressed as key workers and
yes,
ostensibly being treated
exactly,
with
right?
more dignity than usual. But the reality is we're
Exactly.
going to expose you to
Right. Yeah.
severe danger and potentially death.
Exactly. Over and over and over again, people would say some version of they say we're essential. What they really mean is we're expendable. That sense has been, it doesn't leave you once you have that realization. And it's only played out more and more so in the way that everything has gone since then. And you either have people who are sort of embracing it, right? This is the kind of nihilism of Trumpism, of Bolsonarism, of reform, right? Of Nigel Farage. The only thing, and I found this really striking in this Trump election, that in 2016, he was promising to like bring back industrial jobs and things like that. This time around, basically it was just revenge. And the thing that he was going to offer you is apparently the pleasure of ASMR audio of chains that are supposedly on people who are being deported, right? Like the only thing that they're offering at this point is somebody else's misery. And that sense is really, really present for people. And I think I made a flippant comment about Keir Starmer, but I think the real problem and the reason that parties like Labour and the Democrats are completely failing to meet this moment is they have no idea how much your average person feels like the garbage that's been scraped off somebody's shoe, right? That this is an experience that people have of walking around during the day, of going to work, of getting on the bus, of whatever it is. And they certainly have it of listening to the news and listening to politicians say something data centers, that's going to solve our problem, and something, send back the small boats and, whatever it is. That sense that we are disposable. Like that was the thing that was on my mind when I was writing a book about grief and trying to write an anti-capitalist book about grief, which is a challenge. That idea that like this system that we live in does not care if we die, even though, as my friend and comrade who also passed this year, speaking of grief, Joshua Clover points out, that capitalism has never stopped trying to replace us, right? Capital is dead labor, et cetera, even as it gets its sole source of value from the activity that humans add to the labor process.
You've talked there about the threat of people being replaced, mass unemployment and so on, and how this would feed into deportations because people would be seen as more expendable and unnecessary to the economy. But you do very much in the piece sort of nuance that, because you emphasize that although there is this sort of everyday talk about automation where it is the entire replacement of entire fields, what's more likely is the breaking down segmentation of existing jobs, with some aspects being automated, some tasks still being carried out by humans. And this even applies to the example of the Waymo taxis, right? Because
Right.
you refer to this term photomation, the way in which AI and automation, it's obviously, advertised as if it has removed humans from the production process. But you write about how it seems quite likely that the Waymo taxis actually have remote human drivers who are doing some of the driving, presumably partly just to prevent these machines from, killing people.
If they are doing that. Yeah, I mean, these things are all trained on, right? That the dead labor in all of the machine learning apps, right, in ChatGPT or in whatever, is us. It was funny because while I was working on that article, I had to sort of do a reCAPTCHA, and it was like, label all the things that have a traffic light in them. And, you're like, oh, I'm training an automated car right now. That's what I'm doing, right? There's that.
If you're lucky, it's that or like something to do with a drone strike, right?
Right, exactly. Right. And we don't know. And this is something that like tech workers have brought up with me too over the years, is the way that the work is like so broken down into little tiny pieces. Phil Jones's book, Work Without the Workers, which is a great book about the phenomenon of click work and how it's been dispersed sort of around the globe, everywhere from refugee camps full of Palestinians who've been displaced from Gaza to big call centers and typing click centers. I don't know, what do we call them when they're not call centers, but they're just rows of people doing whatever on a series of iPhones or on a computer, whatever it is, right? That this stuff is all trained on human brains. It's either trained on scraping books, basically making it super smart autocomplete. There's people sitting somewhere with overseeing these robots. And maybe they're overseeing 200 of them, and there's because the drive is always still to minimize human labor. But it's also to find the super exploitable human labor. And so when you no longer have to have an Uber driver in Los Angeles who you have to pay a wage that they can live on in Los Angeles, although they still don't, now you can get somebody who is in Bangladesh or in a refugee camp outside of Gaza who they can pay an absolute pittance to sort of oversee something, do a couple of clicks, right? That is a different phenomenon. And it's not that they can just remove us entirely from the process, but that they can tailorize it in like a new and exciting and even crappier way. They break it down even smaller. And this is sort of what the tech allows them to do. And so somebody said to me, are you worried about ChatGPT coming for your job? And I'm like, no, I'm worried about the next person who will never get to have a job like mine because their job will just be correcting the thing that ChatGPT has written. And they will be expected to churn out 20 articles a day rather than, 5 a week or whatever it was that I used to do when I worked at a kind of content farmy place back when I was getting started. The destruction of the entry-level job is one of the things that's happening. The destruction of the service industry job in a lot of ways has already been happening. But the question of sort of what happens when you just remove people from any ability to access a decent life is at some point there's a reason why, Comrade Clover's book in which he made this point was called Riot, Strike, Riot.
Another point you make is that this phenomenon of de-skilling people, automating away some of their tasks, and the really sort of extraordinarily palpable hostility that there is towards AI and automation. I mean, you make the point about the contrast between the line coming from, a government like Keir Starmer's, where it's all, we need to embrace these technologies. This is where growth is. When you actually talk to ordinary people about, what they think about this stuff, it is just total hostility. It's hostility. It's fear. And you argue that it's in some ways quite reminiscent of the dawn of the industrial age, right? Where people responded to the creation of the factory system as similarly involving a de-skilling, robbing people of their dignity, and that this resulted in things like Luddism and violence against the machines. And you make that comparison with the torching of the Waymo vehicles as embodying that kind of spirit too, right?
Yeah, it's not an accident, I think, that, Brian Merchant, Gavin Mueller, Jathan Sadowski have all written books about the Luddites in recent years. The Luddites, it's important to note, right, were very aware of what was happening to them. They weren't just like, oh, technology is scary. They were aware that their labor is being sort of programmed into the machine. We wouldn't have called it programming back then, but like they're aware of the control being taken away, that they're being replaced by this thing, that their labor is being sort of, again, broken down into smaller pieces and studied, and that they're going to lose in this situation, and that the best way to stop losing is to make sure that the boss can't do what he thinks he can do, right? Sometimes that is downing tools, sometimes that is smashing tools.
Your most recent book, From the Ashes, is on the question of grief, and it's both, in some ways, a very personal book. You write about the death of your father, but it's also looking at the political valence of grief and how we think about grief, or in some ways, how we don't think about it.
Yeah.
You've talked a lot about how there is extraordinary resistance to thinking about it. How are you seeing that in the current moment, which is obviously characterized by a tremendous amount of violence, ICE officials gunning people down in the streets now? So have you thought through the themes of the book in this particular context, or does it in some ways not seem that dissimilar because there is always a tremendous amount of violence in the world, and particularly in the United States?
Yeah, it's not surprising, right, that there's been this massive outpouring of action in Minneapolis, but around the country in response to the death on camera of this woman who was just trying to support her neighbors. The fact that her wife was in the car with her when she was shot, like people's reaction to that is really visceral because we can imagine. And because we saw it, that there's something about the fact that we see this all happening, whether it is people being killed, still being killed despite the quote unquote ceasefire in Gaza, or whether it is people being killed in Minneapolis, or whether it is any other number of ways that the system is death making, right? I'm thinking of the hunger strikers here in Britain, right? And the way that the system is death making it changes, it can shift. it can move it around, as my friend Nate Holdren points out, but like it is at the end of the day not concerned with our ability to live. And understanding that, again, on a visceral level, like people came to realize during COVID, like people come to realize when they see a woman shot down by an agent of the state, that it does something to you. To say that the system is not designed for humans is, it's all very well and good as a slogan, but it's something else to really see it happen. It's something else to really experience it in front of you. I do think, again, that there are sort of two ways that can go. And I already sort of said, like Trump and Farage and the rest of them are sort of offering you the pleasures of violence. I'm thinking of the riots last summer here in Britain, right? Of the people trying to set refugee hotels on fire here in Ireland and other places. The sort of compensatory violence that is offered, right, is one way to respond to feeling disposable yourself, is to make somebody else disposable too. I don't want to say that grief always makes us good people. It does not. But I think, again, the fact that there's this shift in the numbers, right, that people in the U.S. are now a plurality, are in favor of abolishing ICE, that has changed, right? Its approval rating was net positive when Trump came back into office this time. If you watch Keir Starmer is still parroting reforms terminology. Somebody from Labor said something about open borders today as we're recording, which is Friday the 16th. It is changeable when people really sort of see themselves in the picture in a different way. And I think we sort of depressingly, I'm going to try not to leave everybody with despair, but I do.
Oh well, wait till you hear my last question.
Oh,
Sarah.
great!
Unfortunately,
Good.
We are going to finish on a depressing note. It's PTO. That's what we do.
I'll do my best. No, but in the book, I sort of say, like, look, everyone we love will die. I do not think, sorry, Elon Musk, that we're going to solve death or create like 1 billion digital people or whatever it is that these lunatic, people think we're going to do. No. That's happening to all of us. I'm sorry to tell you. I really don't like it, but it's true. But also, the world that we live in now produces so much absolutely unnecessary grief and human misery that we could stop and we could improve and we could actually have a world where we invest our money in care rather than in data centers so that Grok can make naked deepfakes of your 12-year-old daughter. These are choices. You can decide. We can decide how we want the world to go forward. We're going to have to figure out how to fight the data centers. It's being fought sort of place by place, city by city, state by state. But as a general concept, these things are still going to just keep setting the planet on fire faster. So they are actually of concern to all of us, even if you don't really care that much that Grok is making deepfakes of your 12-year-old daughter. The sense of that these are priorities, these are choices. We could make them differently. And we want to make them differently, and that we will see people like making those choices very differently with their bodies in the streets in Minneapolis in the middle of winter. It's really putting into action that principle that I referred to earlier, right? That an injury to one is an injury to all. And I believe that. And I believe that we could actually build a world based on that principle. And I think most people would like it better.
Absolutely. All right, finally, so my cheerful final question then. So I thought we could just sort of finish off by going back to ICE and our friend Donald Trump. We've had, of course, this sort of long-running fascism debate on the left, whether Trump and the MAGA movement can be so described. And it's long been pointed out by some people who are sort of critical of the notion that it can be compared to 20th century fascism, is that Trump and MAGA sort of lacks a kind of paramilitary wing, right? It doesn't have the equivalent of the brown shirt. One can quibble with whether that's ever been true. There's always been a violent element. But some people are now making the point that ICE and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Force are increasingly able to play such a role, right? They're highly militarized, and that the attacks that we see on migrants and activists seeking to support them, that perhaps presages a broader crackdown on political dissent, and we could see ICE and similar agencies sort of taking on that role. Where do you stand on that, and how concerned are you by that at this point?
Well, look, there was a leaked list of supposed ICE or DHS agents this week, and one of them appears to be the former leader of the Proud Boys. So, maybe these guys are all getting involved in the militarization of the state. I mean, look, the militarization of the U.S. state and the U.S. police predates Donald Trump, right? I wrote about it. Again, there's a whole chapter on that in my first book where I trace it through anti-communism, through the crackdown on 1960s movements. The first SWAT raid in the country was in Los Angeles. It was on the Black Panthers headquarters. The growth through the war on terror after the end of the Cold War. None of this is new. And paramilitaries in the U.S., I would like to introduce everybody to the Ku Klux Klan, right? And if people weren't interested in all of this, they burned down a synagogue this week in Mississippi that had been burned down before by, I believe, the actual Klan that time, although who knows, they didn't investigate those things. I think it was George Jackson, right, who would talk about American fascism already existing while he was in a U.S. prison. This sense that the U.S. state and its deputized, more or less, white supremacist agents of violence, that's baked into the U.S. state, right? People have been talking about, is ICE the Gestapo? And they're like, no, they're slave catchers. That this history is old and that Hitler took some notes from the U.S. So that FDR, who everybody points to as the best president ever, was the one who made the detention camps for people of Japanese descent in the U.S. during World War II, right? Notably, they didn't put Germans in detention camps. So racism, white supremacy, militarized violence is all sort of baked into the history of the U.S. state. Luckily, so is resistance to it. I have been thinking, here's one to end on. Also in, I think, 2016, or maybe it was 2015. Anyway, when Kristen Godsey launched her Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism book, I hosted her New York launch. Kristen is an ethnographer of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was just like, so Kristen, what does it feel like when an empire falls apart? Because I think the U.S., there was a movie called Civil War this year or last year. There is an old comic book series called DMZ that I used to like that was about a potential U.S. Civil War. But the reality, and I wrote a little tiny piece about this for The Nation this year, and its anniversary issue called These Disunited States. And I was like, look, it's not going to be state on state this time around. It's often state governments versus their own cities. It's often city governments versus their own people, as well as the federal government versus cities and states. And that's what we've been talking about this entire time, right? So, we should remember that one of the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union was, I believe, the biggest fall in living standards in recordable human history. So, it's not going to be pretty. It is a mess, and it is falling apart. And the thing we didn't really talk about at all, the sort of Elon Musk and his Doge department trying to dismantle as much of the state as they could, often sometimes having to scramble and hire back a bunch of people they just fired because it turns out that was a part of the state that Trump did actually need. This whole thing is doing a lot of damage that can't be undone. Some of the things they're breaking we might actually prefer to keep broken. Some of the things we would like to rebuild, some of the things we have never had we would like to build, like a healthcare system. But what it looks like when a big, massively armed behemoth empire like the U.S. is dying it's not pretty. It's anyone's guess. And I think the only thing that's going to get us through any of it is actually, is the kind of work that's going on in places like Minneapolis and Memphis and Chicago and New Orleans and Los Angeles right now. And it is literally people bringing food to their neighbors who are afraid to leave the house because of ICE. And it's people forming a human chain outside the school so that the kids can get into the school safely. We either make it real that we take care of each other or they get us.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.